tonight. So thank you, Michelle, for all the hard work.
Welcome.
She's going to be running all of the technological side of things. A handful of housekeeping things before we begin. First, thank you everybody for coming for our first ever virtual homecoming event. When we learned that homecoming was going to be virtual, the college knew that it was important to create meaningful and relevant discussion about real issues that we're facing today. Put simply, it was a good decision for the college not to presume that things are normal when indeed things are not normal. So the events throughout the week are designed to bring you timely conversations from a Roberts and Northwestern perspective that will enrich, motivate, and challenge you. And I should clarify there that my perspective and my voice is one among many at Northeastern and Roberts. So I cannot presume to be giving you the Northeastern perspective or the Roberts perspective. But in places where we all disagree, other people may say things differently than me, you should go with what I say because I'm typically correct. You should also be aware right up front that sarcasm is somewhat of a love language of mine, and you should take very little of what I say seriously. That's not a good way to start, is it? You should just expect some sarcasm. All right, so in terms of announcements, we're going to be recording the session, and we're going to post it to the website for those who can't make it live. So you are being recorded now, just so you're aware. The chat is going to be disabled, and it may already be until a time for questions and discussion. So if you have questions or thoughts or things to contribute to a conversation, I expect the talk to last for about half of this, and then we'll fill out the rest, the second half, with a Q&A. And just as a reminder, you can change the view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen by selecting speaker view or gallery view. So you have the freedom to make those decisions all on your own. Okay, so I think that's it, Michelle. Are there any other housekeeping items I should mention? Okay. So with all of that in order, I now turn to my timely conversation topic. For those of you whom I haven't met, I'm a Bible scholar, and so I was asked, unsurprisingly, to talk about the Bible. I also just finished developing a 4-part mini course at Northeastern Seminary on the topic, Reading Luke in a Polarized World. And you can register for that course, and you can take it online at your own pace, and it's completely free. Little plug there. But my time in the last 6 or 8 weeks of teaching and reading around in Luke gave rise to a number of thoughts that I thought would be good for us to discuss tonight. And again, we'll have a Q&A at the end, so if you have thoughts or questions, jot them down as we go. All right, so to begin, I want to invite you to join me in an act of imagination. Imagine with me a world. It's an environment of uncertainty and unrest, an environment of fear and anxiety. Politically, power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of wealthy elite men. If these elites want to obtain an official position, they'd better show loyalty to the guy at the top, and if they step out of line, they're essentially fired, since the leader is untrusting, even paranoid, about things like insurrection. It's a world in which transitions in political power are especially worrisome, not least because the psychological fitness of certain political leaders have been called into question on more than one occasion, perhaps due to some previous erratic behaviors and some questionable but consequential decisions made in the past. Economically, it's a world of haves and have-nots. The economic system consistently benefits the wealthy elite, and the poorest are exploited and pushed to the margins of society. The haves keep getting richer, and an ever-widening wealth gap creates a situation where most households are just one hardship away from facing a real crisis that could throw them into abject poverty. Socially, it's a world of inequality. Women work as hard or harder than men and often accomplish just as much in their vocations, but without the recognition of status afforded to men. Society disables people with bodies that don't match the majority culture. Tensions between racial and ethnic groups produce constant conflict that often results in destructive and even deadly violence. The society claims to be a beacon of justice, but the powerful and the privileged reap the most of the material benefits, while the majority persist in uncertainty. It's a world of religious plurality, and religion often gets tied to politics in ways that seem to benefit those who currently possess the most political power. Political leaders presume to speak for God, which means that the loss of the leader would entail the loss of God's purposes for this society. But not all religious folks agree with this view. Thus, the religious conflicts are as divisive as the political and economic ones. Some religious leaders are quite cozy with political leaders, but other religious folks are furious with these same governmental arrangements and want to overthrow them all with a burn it all down mentality. As a result, even people who worship the same God are torn apart by their social, political, and economic disagreements. To put it simply, it's an age of turmoil. I'm, of course, describing the Mediterranean world of the first century. I don't know what you thought I was describing. It was in this world that Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God, and it was from these sorts of environments that Luke's gospel emerged as a narrative of Jesus's life and ministry. The word gospel literally means good news, and Christians affirm that Luke and other gospels bear witness to the truths around which we should orient our lives. Luke's gospel, we believe, had good news for Christians in the tumultuous first century, and we affirm that it has good news for us in our current age. So what is this good news? I have a few thoughts on this, so I'm glad you asked. Now you're stuck here to listen to the answer. But after spending some time in the material, I thought it would be helpful to focus our attention on God's kingdom in Luke's gospel and to anchor our discussions in Jesus's teaching in Luke 6. I told you I'm a Bible teacher, so if you have your text, feel free to whip it out and turn to Luke 6. To begin, the kingdom of God. Scholars overwhelmingly agree that the kingdom of God lies at the core, the very heart of Jesus's message, and it provides the dominant reference point for his mission. Put differently, if we ask ourselves, what is Jesus all about? The answer is that he was all about God's kingdom. So what then is the kingdom of God? In very broad terms, the kingdom of God refers to God's reign or God's rule in the whole universe. To be sure, the idea of God's kingship didn't begin with Jesus. Although the Old Testament tells of human kings ruling over God's people, God's kingship is assumed throughout the Bible. So when Jesus steps onto the scene and announces that the good news of the kingdom of God has come near, he doesn't offer a brand new idea. Instead, he picks up on an ancient theme and announces that God's reign on earth is present in him, in his message, and in his ministry. Now, despite the widespread agreement that Jesus' message and ministry center on God's kingdom, late 19th and 20th century scholarship featured several debates about Jesus' proclamation of God's kingdom. Scholars asked, for example, does Jesus present God's kingdom as a realm in the sense of a domain or a territory or a space? Or is it more like an action in the sense of God's exertion of power? Is the kingdom of God, moreover, a present reality? Or is it a future reality? After much debate, some consensus seems to have emerged. To all of these questions, scholars have essentially answered yes. Is the kingdom of God a domain or a set of actions? Well, yes. It's a dynamic power at work in the world to bring about alignment with God's purposes. And it's territorial or spatial because wherever that happens is wherever the kingdom of God is. Is God's kingdom a present reality or a future one? Here again, the answer is yes. If I could synthesize the gospel portrayals of the kingdom of God in a single statement, I'd say that the kingdom of God is God's reign on earth. inaugurated in Jesus' ministry, and presently at work in the world in anticipation of a future reality in which God's kingdom will be fully accomplished in all of the cosmos. Scholars have encapsulated this both and view by referring to God's reign as the already not yet kingdom of God. It's here and present, but it's not fully accomplished. It's already not yet. And here I have to chuckle a little bit because sometimes scholars come up with really long technical sounding words to describe things. And sometimes we simply say, it's already not yet, to say that it's both. I digress. But with those general concepts in mind, our focus tonight is on Luke's gospel. What can we learn about God's kingdom in the Gospel of Luke? And a few points come to mind, and I'll just mention them briefly. First, once Jesus is born, baptized, and tempted by Satan, he preaches what we might call his inaugural sermon at Nazareth in Luke chapter 4. And then he continues with his ministry in Galilee, empowered by the Spirit. After casting out demons and performing healings in Capernaum, Jesus makes his first reference to God's kingdom in Luke, saying to his disciples, I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to other cities also, for I was sent for this purpose. Jesus describes his own purpose in terms of the proclamation of God's kingdom. From there, he announces God's reign with proclamations, teachings, and parables, and he embodies it especially in demon expulsions and in healings. Luke makes clear the inseparable link between God's kingdom and the person of Jesus in an encounter he has with the Pharisees in Luke 17, 20-21. After the Pharisees ask when the kingdom of God is coming, Jesus responds by telling them, the kingdom of God is among you. As if to say, if you want to see the kingdom, you're looking at it when you see me talking to you. Luke links the person of Jesus with the kingdom of God. Second, Jesus' followers are also agents of God's reign. Put differently, God does God's work in the world through people, and specifically through Jesus and Jesus' followers. In Luke 9, for example, he calls his disciples together, and in Luke's words, he, quote, gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal, end quote. Jesus tells his followers in Luke 12:32, quote, do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, end quote. At the Last Supper, Jesus says to his disciples, quote, I confer on you, just as my Father has conferred on me a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Luke goes on in Acts to tell the story of how Jesus' earliest followers continued this kingdom message and this kingdom ministry after his death and resurrection, and Acts even ends at chapter 28 with Paul proclaiming the kingdom of God in Rome. So to tie all this together, the Bible portrays God as a king who exerts God's reign through people. This God has inaugurated a kingdom on earth through the person of Jesus. And if this kingdom is to continue in the world after Jesus' death and resurrection, then it will continue through Jesus' followers. This is the heart of the Gospels, including Luke's Gospel, and the core of the good news that these Gospels proclaim. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but this is not what I grew up hearing. This was a new message to me later in life. I was taught that I needed to really, really believe a certain specific set of truths in my heart of hearts, and to say a certain prayer so that my soul would go to heaven when I die. Now, I do think it's important that we believe certain truths. But in addition to my confusion over hearing that my heart has a heart, I was surprised later to discover that the Gospel's vision for the kingdom of God is so this worldly in their focus. As Jesus' prayer in Matthew puts it, they desire to see God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So we have a general framework, God's reign on earth through Jesus and Jesus' followers. But what does this look like? I'm glad you asked. Let's put some clothes on this framework. I turn now to Luke 6 to anchor some of our ideas. It says as follows, he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." This differs from Matthew's, "Blessed are you who are poor in spirit." Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, when they revile you and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Thanks, Jesus. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, he says. For surely your reward is great in heaven. For that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. So if you want to be the prophetic people, you can expect the consequences that prophets face. But then the reversal. Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when people speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. There's a lot we could say about this passage in the larger context of Luke. But I want to make only a few observations before we open things up for discussion. First, the kingdom of God is a political reality with political implications and political consequences. It is, after all, a kingdom. And after Jesus, the Anointed One, proclaimed his kingdom, he was put to death in a state-sponsored form of execution. It's natural, therefore, that Jesus' followers would form, in some sense, a political body that works together in and with communities to achieve a certain way of living together in the world. So it's not quite accurate then to conclude that Jesus' followers shouldn't get political, as we sometimes say, or that we shouldn't work towards distinctively political ends. Being political is, after all, in our DNA as followers of the one who established the kingdom of God on earth. Being political does not, however, mean that our political ways of being can be reduced to a particular set of partisan platforms or policies. If we're to recognize and embody Luke's witness in our tumultuous age, it's critical that we recognize that the kingdom of God cannot be conflated with any given nation state. Put bluntly, the kingdom of God never has been, is not, and never will be the United States of America, and the same is true for any other country. Jesus inaugurated God's reign, which is free and untamable. We therefore make a grave error, and we hinder our witness to the living God when we too easily link our political allegiances with partisan agendas, and when we outsource our prophetic voices to the state and its representatives. Second, the statement, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God," illustrates that in the literary world of Luke, there exists an inseparable relationship between the political, the economic, and the social. We Americans like to divide these categories from one another. I have friends who assert things, for example, like they are fiscally conservative or socially liberal or whatever else the other options out there might be, as if we could divide the fiscal from the social and the moral. In this passage I read earlier, Jesus proclaims reversals for distinct categories of people: the poor, the hungry, and those who weep. As New Testament scholar Joel Green has demonstrated, the category of poor in Luke does not merely refer to people without money. To be poor in Luke, rather, refers to those whom society has marginalized due to a lack of resources, an illness, a disability, or some affliction. To these disenfranchised people, Jesus preaches and accomplishes their salvation. If we simply follow Luke's salvation language in the Greek with words like sozo in the Greek, we find that Jesus' salvation was embodied, holistic, and social. In addition to saving lives, Luke uses the term sozo to save in Greek for healings, cleansings, and demon expulsions. For example, after Jesus' power healed the woman who'd suffered from hemorrhages for 12 years, he says to her, "Your faith has made you well." The verb that the NRSV translates made you well is actually the verb sozo, which we typically translate as save. He uses the same verb to say the same thing to a leper he'd cleansed in 1719, to a blind person he was healing in 1841, and he uses the term to reference a demon expulsion in Luke 8:36. All this to say, Luke's vision of salvation within the kingdom of God involves much more than a person's soul. It focuses on their lives in the present. As a commentator I read recently so simply put it, Luke cares about bodies. Jesus' salvation liberates and makes whole the entire person. This salvation is also social. People in the ancient world with certain mental or bodily conditions were marginalized and risked not having their basic needs met. Not in every case, but in many cases, disabilities, diseases, and disorders could not only lower a person's status, but it could also exclude them from community and from well-being. Thus, when Jesus heals bodies or delivers people from demonic oppression, he liberates them from oppressive structures that disenfranchise and disable them. And he opens up new opportunities for full participation in life-sustaining community. Put simply, when Jesus embodies the kingdom of God, he liberates and transforms the whole lives of those whom society has marginalized. We find this again encapsulated in the statement, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." In the words of Isaiah that Jesus quotes in Luke 4, this is good news for the poor. But according to the same passage we read from Luke 6, as you remember, this kingdom message involves woes for the rich, for the well-fed, and woes for those who are privileged enough to have security to laugh instead of mourning. Luke, among all of the Gospels, features the harshest demands on the rich. Why would he do this? After all, is it a problem to be rich? I wouldn't know. No, in fact, some rich folks do some great things in and for God's kingdom in Luke. So why the need for all these woes? Why such heavy demands on the rich in Luke's gospel? One reason, I think, is that Luke doesn't operate from an individualistic worldview that assumes that the circumstances of the marginalized are due to their own failings. Rather, Jesus' message and mission reveal the degree to which people are interconnected and interdependent. Thus, when the wealthy exist perpetually alongside the impoverished, Luke indicates that this is evidence not so much of just deserts, but rather evidence of economic injustice. If some have enough surplus to be considered rich, then implicitly God's reign on earth demands that they use those resources that they have available to help those who don't have enough. Thus, Luke features radical themes of reversal summed up well in Mary's prophetic song, in which she sings that God has shown strength with God's arm, God has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts, God has brought down the powerful from thrones and exalted the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Now, to be sure, this good news for the poor doesn't have to be bad news for those with resources. But in Luke's gospel, the proper response to God's kingdom is to give and to share. Like the women who financially support Jesus' ministry in Luke 8:1-3, that is, women with vocations supporting them out of their own wealth, or Zacchaeus is giving away of his wealth, the proper response of the rich to God's kingdom in Luke is to contribute to the social and economic realities that God is trying to bring about through Jesus and his followers. But all of this underlies the point that I want to emphasize here tonight. The kingdom of God is political, but it is also social and it's economic. And the realization of God's kingdom on earth involves liberation, restoration, and justice for those whom society has marginalized. Some closing thoughts. So with these ideas before us, what is the witness of Luke's gospel for our current tumultuous age? I want to offer two ideas, or 2 points, and then I'll open it up for discussion. First, Jesus lived in a world of divisions and disputes, but he preached and lived the truth with conviction. He picked sides, so to speak. But Christians confess that he in fact chose God's side by aligning his message and his ministry with God's reign in the world. In Luke's gospel, this means that he consistently chose the side of the poor, the marginalized, and the disenfranchised. Followers of Jesus in our tumultuous age would do well to follow his example. God is at work in our world. How will we know if our words and our actions are aligned with God's? I don't have the full answer to that question, and if I did, I would be a really important person. As you know, I'm already a very important person, but I would be even more important if I had that answer. Again, I joke. But in our discernment, I think we can ask some pretty pressing questions that arise from Jesus's descriptions of his own calling. We can ask ourselves, for example, whether the things we say and the things we do are indeed good news for the poor. We can press ourselves to discern whether our messaging calls for the release of those who are in captivity, whether we can evaluate consistently whether our work whether our work improves the circumstances of those whom society has disabled, and whether it results in the oppressed going free, and whether it leads in some to economic justice. When we can meet those criteria, I think we can at least be optimistic that we're heading in the right direction. Second, Jesus relates to others, and he related to enemies, but he never confused the other with the enemy. In Luke, Satan is the ultimate enemy and the source of opposition to the coming of God's kingdom. Luke 4, for example, portrays the whole world as the devil's possession, and Judas betrays Jesus after Satan enters into him. One could thus view the whole of Jesus' ministry as an attack on Satan's evil power, evidenced above all in Jesus' demon expulsions. But Jesus also had opponents with whom he disagreed, and his most bitter disputes in Luke are with the Pharisees. Yet, as one of my favorite former seminary professors pointed out, despite all of Jesus' disagreements with the Pharisees, he never stopped eating with them. In Jesus' day, table fellowship formed a visual sign of mutuality, reciprocity, and community. To be sure, Jesus disagreed with them, and we should not naively assume that all ideas or claims are equally as valid as others. They're not. Yet if we want to follow Jesus' example and embody the kingdom ethics that he taught, we must be willing humbly to cross the same sorts of ideological, religious, political, and social boundaries that we find transgressed in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. This requires us to cultivate the virtues of humility, patience, and forgiveness. So on those notes, I conclude not with my own remarks, but with some of Jesus' marks that follow immediately after the passage that I've read from Luke 6 tonight. Jesus says, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. These, my friends, are the ethics of the kingdom of God in an age of turmoil. May it be so.